Horror cinema has long been one of the most profitable and culturally revealing genres, capable of exploiting fear, desire, and social anxieties in ways that make it both a site of popular entertainment and scholarly debate. In recent years, much of the conversation has centered on modern studios like A24, Blumhouse, and Neon, companies whose logos alone now shape audience expectations about the kind of horror they're about to see. But for those who grew up in the 1990s or 2000s, a different name once carried that same weight: New Line Cinema. If the name doesn't ring a bell, you're probably familiar with the iconic logo which is played at the start of numerous culturally defining films. From horror classics to blockbuster fantasies, New Line transformed from a tiny film distributor into a powerhouse defined first by its incredible horror efforts. Among the many production companies that have shaped horror's trajectory, New Line stands out as a studio that not only embraced the genre, but relied upon it for survival and growth. Dubbed the house that Freddy built after the runaway success of A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984, New Line exemplifies how horror franchises can generate both economic power and cultural resonance. In many ways, it paved the way for the kind of brand recognition that fans now associate with A24, Blumhouse, and Neon. That legacy resurfaced for many of us recently with New Line's recent logo rebranding. Since 2011, the company had been saddled with a logo that tethered it awkwardly to Warner Brothers, a design where fragments of the Warner Brothers shield form the New Line logo. At last, that long-running frustration has ended, with the debut of a brand new, refreshed logo. Fittingly, one of the first films to carry it was The Watchers, a reminder that horror has always been central to New Line's DNA. But for me, the moment hit hardest when I saw the logo appear for the first time on the big screen before Final Destination Bloodlines, a cherry on top of an already nostalgia-filled event. Honestly, I could have wept. From the 1970s through today, few studios have left such a deep imprint on the genre, making New Line an enduring cornerstone of American horror cinema. But its history feels surprisingly unsung, which is why I wanted to explore it in this video, a deep dive that I hope will be both enlightening and deeply nostalgic. New Line Cinema traces its beginnings to 1967, arriving just as Hollywood was closing out a turbulent decade. A wave of bold filmmakers were redefining what American movies could be, while the long-standing Hays Code, an industry rulebook that had dictated film content since the 1930s, was on the verge of being dismantled. A new chapter in US cinema was about to begin, and 27-year-old Robert Shaye founded New Line to seize the moment with a different kind of distribution model, a model which specialized in supplying foreign and art films for college campuses in the United States. I can't help but quickly mention here my favorite fact about Robert Shaye. His sister is Lynn Shaye. Yes, that Lynn Shaye, most famous to my generation for her appearances within the Insidious franchise. But more relevant to this video, she also appeared in A Nightmare on Elm Street and Critters. Okay, back to Robert. An early breakthrough for New Line came with its distribution of the 1936 anti-cannabis propaganda film Reefer Madness, which found new life as a cult favorite on American college campuses during the early 1970s. In its early years, New Line also released many classic foreign language films and many of the films of John Waters. In 1970, New Line Cinema dipped its toes into the world of horror for the very first time with the release of Multiple Maniacs, a John Waters film that blended horror elements with several other genres. New Line released the films that major studios just wouldn't, and they understood that there was an audience for these movies. In 1976, New Line Cinema secured funding to produce its first full-length feature, a thriller called Stunts. Although this wasn't a critical success, the film performed well commercially on the international market and on television, and was an early sign of just how big the company could go on to grow. The company continued to release provocative, sometimes horror films, such as Immoral Tales and The Cars That Ate Paris. In fact, in 1981, they nabbed the distribution rights to The Evil Dead, after seeing Stephen King's rave review of the film after it had screened at film festivals. Unfortunately, they didn't secure the rights to either of the film's sequels. But in 1983, they incredibly secured the rights to re-release the horror classic The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But still, it wouldn't be until the following year that New Line truly forged a lasting horror identity and kicked off their very own franchise. By the early 1980s, the horror market was saturated with slasher hits like Halloween and Friday the 13th. Against this backdrop, rising filmmaker Wes Craven struggled to secure support for his latest project, A Nightmare on Elm Street. While still recognizable as a slasher, its premise, murders taking place in dreams, struck many studios as too strange or risky. Disney requested a toned-down, family-friendly version, Paramount declined over similarities to the film Dreamscape, and Universal offered distribution but no funding. Ultimately, it was New Line Cinema, shifting from distribution into producing its own films, and betting on horror as a low-cost, high-return genre, that agreed to take the gamble, committing just $700,000 to the project. The production was grueling. With money stretched impossibly thin, the cast and crew worked unpaid for 2 weeks, and tensions often flared behind the camera. Craven and New Line founder Robert Shea clashed most bitterly over the ending. Craven pushed for a definitive conclusion, while Shea insisted on an open-ended twist that would leave room for sequels, a choice that, in hindsight, ensured Freddy Krueger's longevity. When the film finally premiered on November 9, 1984, A Nightmare on Elm Street grossed $25 million in the US and $57 million worldwide, becoming New Line's very first true hit. Critics highlighted the film's originality, noting how it broke away from the repetitive slasher formula dominating the era. Unlike the silent mass killers that had become cliches, Freddy Krueger was something altogether different, a supernatural figure targeting teenagers within their very own minds. Once A Nightmare on Elm Street proved its worth, New Line pressed on with turning this film into a franchise. Craven himself stepped away uninterested, but since the rights belonged to New Line, the studio carried on without him. Over the following decade, 5 more entries hit theaters, some well received and others less so, but all financially rewarding. In 1986, New Line went public with over 1.6 million shares of common stock, a milestone only made possible by Freddy's box office success. Freddy didn't just define a franchise, he transformed the company's fortunes, earning New Line the nickname The House That Freddy Built.
It's the boy!
They had this expression for many years at New Line that it was the house that Freddy built. It's the house that Freddy built, the house that Freddy built, I think, a few wings on.
A Nightmare on Elm Street was the very first huge hit. People started really thinking of them seriously as a studio.
Every time you have a success, it propels your company forward. That was our first one.
He really brought the company to a level where they could potentially compete.
We went from a company that was very little known to be much more respected.
This is the place that you think of when you think of quality horror films.
New Line has grown from the independent world to a big studio.
Following the success of the Elm Street franchise, New Line Cinema entered into a unique agreement with RCA Columbia Pictures Home Video, in which they partially financed 10 upcoming New Line theatrical features prior to distributing them in the worldwide home video market. The first 2 films in this deal were Critters 1 and 2, New Line's answer to the success of Gremlins. New Line went on to produce a slew of other horror films, such as The Mangler about a killer washing machine, Man's Best Friend, a Terminator-style dog film, and The Hidden, a sci-fi horror. Entering the 1990s, the studio expanded into other well-known franchises, beginning with Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Come 1991, enthusiasm had started to fade, leading to Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, the studio's effort to finally conclude the franchise. But 3 years later, Wes Craven decided that he wasn't finished with Freddy just yet.
Mark it, common mark.
I'm doing a film about my nightmares as I'm dreaming them. In order for the movie to continue, it was dependent on me having more nightmares. Well, fortunately, I did.
I'm a little frightened by what Wes may have tapped into. I frankly felt that it was over when we did The Final Nightmare.
In a town where movies go over schedule and directors go over budget, something far more evil is out of control.
Craven revisited the character with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a meta-horror experiment that blurred the line between fiction and reality. Rewatching it today, it's easy to view the film as just a trial run for Craven's next horror effort, Scream. But in all honesty, it's so much more than just a testing ground. It's an incredible, genre-shifting film in its own right. The film reintroduced Freddy as a darker, more menacing presence, this time stalking actress Heather Langenkamp in her own life. In a surreal twist, both Craven and Robert Shea appeared on screen as themselves, and parts of the movie were even filmed inside New Line's offices. No matter how you rank them, the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels truly cemented Freddy Krueger as a horror icon. Unlike the mute, expressionless killers who dominated the genre before him, he combined cruelty with dark humor, delivering sardonic one-liners alongside brutal kills. Sure, some people, Craven somewhat included, didn't like just how much some of the later entries pre-New Nightmare lent into the character's humorous one-liners. But there's no denying that this was what set Krueger apart. He was just as depraved as he was funny. Without Freddy Krueger, it's hard to imagine later horror villains like Chucky or Art the Clown, characters who owe much to his prototype blend of terrifying and perversely funny.
Your big break in TV! Fuck the prime time, bitch! Krueger! Well, it ain't Dr. Seuss.
In the 1990s, with Freddy Krueger's dominance at the box office fading, New Line needed to find its next cultural juggernaut. In 1990, the studio distributed the very first live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film, a project that, much like A Nightmare on Elm Street, had been rejected by multiple major studios before New Line took a chance. That gamble paid off beyond expectations. The movie became the most successful independent release ever at the time. Sequels followed quickly, with New Line capitalizing on the franchise's runaway popularity. Held up by that success, the company doubled down on horror by securing the rights to Jason Voorhees from Paramount. Their ultimate goal was a crossover, Freddy vs. Jason, though it would take more than a decade to materialize. In the interim, New Line released Jason Goes to Hell and later Jason X. Both performed respectably at the box office, but neither produced Krueger-like numbers. In this battle, it was clear who was New Line's winner. The mid-1990s marked a decisive shift for New Line cinema. On January 28, 1994, Turner Broadcasting bought the studio for $500 million as part of a wave of acquisitions that also included Hanna-Barbera and Castle Rock Entertainment. 2 years later, Turner merged with Time Warner, placing New Line under the same corporate umbrella as Warner Brothers. For New Line, this meant access to far greater resources, bigger budgets, bolder projects, and the freedom to take risks it could never have attempted before. While still operating independently with its own distribution arm, the studio now had the backing to mount large-scale productions. Results were mixed, but horror continued to be a reliable cornerstone of its output. The studio never abandoned its willingness to gamble on unusual, low-budget horror. That strategy led to hits like David Fincher's Seven, a thriller steeped in horror elements, and Blade, a Marvel Comics adaptation that few studios were brave enough to touch. At the time, superhero films were considered a losing bet, but New Line proved otherwise years before the runaway success of Disney and Marvel. All of that, however, was only build-up to the second most defining project in the company's history, The Lord of the Rings. Move over Freddy, Gandalf's in town. Attempts to adapt Tolkien's work had stretched back decades. Then, in 1995, Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, fresh off The Frighteners, pitched Miramax on a trilogy beginning with The Hobbit, followed by 2 Lord of the Rings films. But Miramax executives demanded Jackson compress the entire saga into a single 2-hour movie, and threatened to cancel the project if he refused. With this, Jackson took the pitch elsewhere. At New Line, Robert Shea immediately saw the potential, but he insisted that the adaptation be done properly. Not 2 Lord of the Rings films, but 3, one for each book. To make that happen, New Line committed to an astonishing $270 million production budget, the biggest wager in its history. The gamble paid off. Between 2001 and 2003, Jackson's trilogy dominated the global box office, and even achieved much critical acclaim. The trilogy didn't just succeed, it transformed New Line. Practically overnight, the studio swelled in size, expanding to nearly 600 employees and chasing ever larger productions. But while The Lord of the Rings had delivered a once-in-a-lifetime triumph, such lightning would prove difficult to capture again. Even amongst this newfound fantasy success, New Line never abandoned their horror franchise roots. 2000's release of Final Destination proved to be another huge hit. Just like with A Nightmare on Elm Street, New Line found great success with making a franchise of this film. Final Destination turned into a long-running franchise, built around a simple but ingenious premise: death itself as the unstoppable villain. The combination of inventive Rube Goldberg-style death sequences, and a pervasive sense of dread resonated with audiences, especially younger viewers. The film's success quickly led to sequels, each expanding on the concept while finding new and creative ways to stage elaborate fatal set pieces. While critics were often divided, the box office told a different story. Final Destination became one of New Line's most dependable franchises, generating steady profits across 5 films and keeping the brand firmly tied to horror well into the 21st century. But unfortunately for New Line, with expanded horizons came more risks of failure. Despite pumping out hits left, right and centre, come the late 2000s, 2 major hits would seriously damage the company. In 2005, Peter Jackson and his company Wingnut Films sued New Line, alleging that they had been cheated out of profits from the Fellowship of the Ring. While the lawsuit was eventually settled in 2007, the damage was done. The legal battles tied up profits and drained goodwill. Meanwhile, with the Lord of the Rings franchise's Hobbit plans on pause, the studio went looking for a new, sweeping fantasy epic. A story that they hoped would save the company, but ultimately destroyed it. With Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials book series as the basis, New Line released The Golden Compass in 2007, a film that didn't lose money but was seen as a box office failure due to its small earnings compared to its huge budget. This film's lackluster performance pushed parent company Time Warner to fold New Line into Warner Brothers in 2008, stripping New Line of its independence. From that point on, New Line existed only as a Warner division, tasked with putting out a handful of genre titles each year. Founder Robert Shea exited the picture entirely, and for a time it seemed the label might quietly disappear once its leftover projects had been released. But over the years, New Line continued to distribute movies, hidden behind a new logo and existing only as a part of Warner Brothers. New Line even revived Friday the 13th in 2009, and finally, the franchise that started it all, A Nightmare on Elm Street in 2010. Sadly for New Line, the public were dissatisfied with both of these efforts and new franchises weren't launched from either of these remakes. But finally, New Line's revival came from the very genre that had defined it decades earlier. After years of leaning on sequels to pre-2008 hits, the studio finally scored an original success under Warner Brothers. This success was The Conjuring that hit theaters in July 2013, and this film did not just succeed, it launched a full-fledged cinematic universe. From there, horror once again became the company's backbone. New Line's banner appeared on a steady stream of genre releases, from additional Conjuring installments to original works like The Gallows, Lights Out, and Malignant. The studio also produced both of Andy Muschietti's Stephen King's It adaptations, both of which became massive box office earners for Warner Brothers, and cemented New Line's renewed identity as Hollywood's modern horror hub. In fact, It Chapter 1 achieved remarkable box office success, grossing approximately $704.2 million worldwide against a production budget of $35 million. This made it the highest grossing horror film at the time. With this, horror certainly seems to be shaping up to be New Line's future as well as its past. Even as its pursuit of blockbusters once pulled it from its roots, horror has remained its most enduring foundation.
Everything came off of Nightmare, and ultimately, so did Lord of the Rings.
With the success of this year's Final Destination Bloodlines, who knows? Maybe we'll even see Freddy return to our screens. Although, if it's not Robert Englund, I simply don't want it. But even without this, newer New Line projects like Evil Dead Rise and Weapons suggest that New Line is leaning back into the space where it has always thrived: inventive, risky, and crowd-pleasing horror. And while the company may now function more as a Warner Brothers label than a true indie company, its legacy as the house that Freddy built remains intact. New Line may never again feel like the outsider studio that once rolled the dice on Tolkien, but as long as that blue retro logo flashes before something sharp, strange, or terrifying, there's still a spark of that old magic. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to know your personal experiences with New Line Cinema. To what franchise do you most associate their logo with? As much as I'm a fan of the horror classics, I grew up in the early 2000s, so I will always associate their logo with Final Destination and the Lord of the Rings. Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out some of my other videos. And be sure to follow me on Instagram, where I've been posting things from my recent horror-inspired travels.